The Canon EOS R3 isn't necessarily the most anticipated camera of the year, but it's definitely one that's got people wondering, especially if you happen to own a Canon 1DX Mark II, or you recently upgraded to the Canon 1DX Mark III. Canon Hong Kong put out an announcement of sorts. We have an announcement on September the 14th for the R3 and a couple of lenses. Now, the announcement doesn't really say what it's going to be covering, but we know from various stories on Canon Rumors from Craig that are CR2 that this is going to be, well, it's the least kept secret. As far as shipment on this camera, this is what we have as new. The shipment is going to be November. And again, that could change. Anything can happen in 2021, as we've seen with the chip shortage. But we're expecting a November shipment. That's planned right now. And the price, 6,999 euros or 5,999 US dollars. So that puts it at about $500 less. $500 less than the 1DX Mark III. And let me show you the specs there we have on this one here. So these are the specs that we have on the Canon R3. You can see that it's got a 24 megapixel full frame back illuminated sensor. That's really a first for Canon. It's 30 frames per second electronic shutter. And I know many are comparing it to the Sony Alpha 1, which has 50 megapixel. That's right, 50 megapixel sensor. I was going to say 50 frames per second, but no, it's 30 frames per second at 50 megapixels. And of course, the Alpha 1 has better video, but the R3 does provide oversampled 4K. So we got a lot of really great specs here. And what I see this as is this is kind of a mirrorless version of the 1DX Mark III. It becomes what I would call the acting flagship camera, because in many ways it's better than honestly, it's better than the 1DX Mark III in almost area. Well, I know there is one area where it's lacking to many people. It doesn't have dual CF Express cards. But if you look at capability versus capability between the two cameras, the R3 is an upgrade over the 1DX Mark III. And we were looking at 30 frames per second electronic, where I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, the 1DX Mark III, what was it? What did it top out? Was it 16 frames per second electronic and 14 mechanical?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And of course,
the nice and fast. And to be fair, I mean, that is ridiculously fast. To shoot more than that, you're coming home with so many extra frames. For photography wise, I mean, for video, I'm sure it has its other benefits, but that's nuts fast. With that kind of resolution, unless you have terabytes and terabytes of backup drives, be selective with those frames. Don't just spray and pray. That'll be ridiculous.
Yeah, you're right. For anybody who shoots as a hobby, it's kind of the equivalent of having a fully automatic, high-powered rifle. You got to be careful how you use that thing. You don't just lay down on the trigger and shoot. You selectively burst.
Bullets. Yeah, massive bullets.
Yeah, and Brian, I've got the 100 millimeter, the Canon RF 100 millimeter f2.8, and I went shooting with that, and I put it in electronic mode where it's 20 frames per second. So I had to beef up my R5. In the CF Express card slot, I have a 2 terabyte CF Express card. And in the SD card slot, I have a 1 terabyte card. I can never remember the name of the company. I should go to the back of the camera and pull it out. But the thing you learn with a high-speed camera is that you selectively burst. You just burst for a little bit. Because when I was out shooting the moon, when I was out shooting wildlife, I hold down that trigger sparingly, and I still came back with like 800 photos that I had to painstakingly go through. Mm-hmm. So it's
with that kind of resolution, I mean that's file size.
Yeah, my iMac or my MacBook Air could only handle, I think, like opening 10 raw files at a time before it said I'm done.
So it's safe to assume that this product is for a very niche customer.
Yeah, I would. Now you're more of a. You'd probably be able to pick up on the use cases and the customers that would buy this. But I'm thinking anybody who's shooting sports, anybody that's shooting anything that's fast action. If you're shooting motorcycles, auto racing, I don't know, maybe even fashion photography. What do you? Where would you see this camera? Who do you think would buy this camera, Brian?
to be fair, I think most mirrorless cameras are most attractive for video function. For photo, at least in the sports world, they're very fast. And I'm just trying to think of my application. Like tomorrow, I'm shooting wrestling, and when you shoot wrestling, you shoot with both eyes open. And I'd like to get the opinion of the other guys on the panel here, but shooting with a mirrorless camera, when you have an electronic viewfinder here, and when you shoot with both eyes open, you have optical in the world here. By the end of a long day, for me at least, I've had a lot of issues with headaches and stuff like that because you're getting completely different stimulation. And now I know on the Nikon viewfinders, the refresh is extremely good and the Sonys are fantastic. I'd like to see the quality of the viewfinder on this, and I hope it's up to par, because if it is, then okay, it makes sense to go that way. But if you're going to be shooting both eyes open and you've got an EVF and an optical, it can become a real problem. And that's something that I've only learned through experience in doing it. Other than that, the person who I'd see using this camera would obviously be a professional, somebody, maybe a gynecologist with a good job, lots of money coming in.
I'm just nodding with this one, Brian. I don't want to dig too deep on that one.
Yeah, I was
if
about
you're
to say,
a
where are you
professional,
going?
you're getting paid from
a
production company. What's that? Sorry, I missed all that.
Yeah,
I was just saying, if you're getting paid from a production company to buy the equipment, and they write that off like production companies do, then it's an amazing camera to go for. I don't see too many retail employees buying one right away. Let's just put it that way.
No, and I don't see it as a camera for me too. And this is where I'm glad you, at the last minute, James, said you could make it here tonight, because otherwise it would have been two photographers against one videographer. And, I look at this camera's video features and I think, it's decent. It's got oversampled 4K. It has Canon R3 and it can do internal raw video. But $6,000 when the R5 exceeds those specifications. What are your thoughts, James?
The question is the overheating. No, I'm just kidding.
No, that's a big point.
That's a big credit. That's a big point.
Yeah. To some, the overheating on the R5 was never a big deal for me, but I know everybody's experience is different. Yeah. For me, from a video perspective, I think this is. The 1DX series was always great. It was a great video camera. A lot of people started their video, at least a lot of people professionally that, especially we know in this YouTube community, had a lot of their big successes on the 1DX series. And this sort of just continues what
Peter McKinnon.
The 1DX Mark III did in terms of the raw video recordings. With that one was I think it was 5.5K. This one I think is 5.9K. So it's kind of like 6. So it's really 6K. I think it's a solid thing in terms of, because you asked the question, who is this for? I look at this as the journalism, the journalists, people who need to go get their photos but want to quickly switch and grab some video footage, some great solid video footage that they can deliver as well. All the video, it's got Canon R3. It's got a lot of it's got obviously raw recording. You can oversample 4K. For people that may maybe looking at the R5 and may want to shoot raw, but didn't want to deal with the 8K, deal with the 8K files. 5K is a lot. 6K files are a lot easier. They're still a little bit heavy, but they're nowhere near as heavy as 8K. I personally say the price. The thing with the price is what kind of throws it off, because I'm looking at the comments and everybody's sort of like $6,000, which if you go by just what they did with their DSLRs, it's not surprising. It's right in that ballpark of the 1DX Mark III, which was $6,500. I think the question is, what is the R1 going to be like? That's the thing. What's the price of the R1 if this one is $6,000?
I got to jump in there because I think you hit it on the head, because I'm thinking the same thing. So this is $500 less than the 1DX Mark III. But you see, I know, because I know how Canon works, and they've been doing this for decades. Canon has a certain way they look at their cameras. They understand exactly who the camera is marketed for. And the R1 has, so I shouldn't say the R1, the 1 series has always been better than the 3 series or the 5 series or any other camera in their lineup when it comes to both video and stills. So it's going to be a better performer than the R1. It's probably going to hit 50 frames per second. It's probably going to have a 45 megapixel to somewhere around 50 or 55 megapixels. I don't see it going higher than that. And of course, video, I see it probably having the same resolutions as the R5. So it'll have 8K RAW, it'll have 4K oversample. But what they'll probably do is eliminate the overheat times. Maybe they'll give us different frame rates on 8K. Maybe they'll give us 8K 60 frames per second.
2 CF Express cards, I see that happening because the R1 is going to be the flagship camera. Someone asked, it's like, did they use the sensor from Sony? Canon makes all their sensors. They're one of the few camera companies that actually builds their own sensors along with Sony. So this is directly from Canon themselves. But yeah, I'm intrigued, but I still think if I'm looking at in terms of video. If I'm looking just purely from video, the C70 is $500 less, and it's a true video camera. It's Super 35, but you throw, the price that you would pay for that, you can throw a focal reducer on there, and you've got not only a full frame field of view, but now you got built-in NDs and all these professional video assist features. There's just too much still lacking from a video perspective, because at the end of the day, it's still going to be a hybrid camera, so there's only so much that this can go.
James, I think you hit it on the head when you said that this is for photojournalists, and maybe the Associated Press, after switching over to Sony, might go like, this is a camera we've been waiting for a long time. This is a camera that's going to give you all the stills you need. But then if you need to capture video that's good enough to air on broadcast television, you've got decent video as well. But now I want to open things up for you in the audience too, because Orlando just said that this is going to be $8,000, but I'll remind you, a lot of people said the same thing about the R5, that it was going to be $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, and then it came in at $3,899, and of course everybody said that was too much. So
I think he's talking about the R1.
I do.
Not the
Yes, sorry, the R1. I do think the R1 is going to cost more than the 1DX Mark III, but I don't think it's going to be exceedingly high. But John, you've been awfully silent on this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to just jump in because you guys were having a lot of good points. I mean, certainly from a photography perspective, I look at the R3 as really a photography beast, especially for fast action shooting such as sports, wildlife, birds particularly, photojournalism. Press events, things like that. Maybe even, maybe weddings and such also. There's a couple of features that you didn't mention, like the eye control autofocus. I don't think you mentioned that.
I didn't.
And and if that works correctly, that could be very huge. I mean, I know they had some beta models out during the Olympics. I really hadn't heard about them in terms of how they performed. I'm sure as the announcement actually comes, then you'll have some demos of how it actually works. That'll be very interesting. I mean, the other thing, of course, that will be interesting is the presence of rolling shutter or lack thereof, especially with the electronic shutter. I mean, at 30 frames a second, it could be amazing, but it could also have significant rolling shutter. I mean,
I don't think it will.
Okay, well, I would hope not, because I don't think also if you had mentioned whether it's going to have the same DigiX processor as the R5 and R6, or if it's going to have an upgraded processor also, because you have to have tremendously fast readout in order to avoid having rolling shutter. So like I said, the R5 has some, but not as much as some other models. But on the other hand, of course, you have the Alpha 1, which has almost none. Price-wise, the R3 also kind of undercuts the Alpha 1, because I think it's at least $500 difference. Not to mention the Alpha 1 doesn't come with an extra, the vertical grip. That's like another $300 or $400 for that. So it does certainly undercut the Alpha 1 to some degree. So there's a lot of things that we know about the R3, and but obviously there's some other things that we really don't know and won't know until we get it in people's hands and really start seeing some reviews coming out, after the official launch. So I'm intrigued. It's more camera than I'll ever need, and definitely I think one of the things that in terms of nomenclature, there's been a lot of discussion about that. It does seem like when the Alpha One came up out of nowhere, it kind of caught Canon with his pants down. This might have been supposed to have been, the R1, and they just decided, well, we have something better. Maybe that was going to be an R1 Mark II a year from now, but we'll just put this out called the R3 and make the real R1 come out next year. So it does lay the groundwork for a lot of interesting technology.
I'm going to poo-poo that a little bit, and the only reason why is, and all we have to do is look to the 1 series and the 5 series and how the 1 series has always had better video and better stills. Now, sometimes, like with the 1DX Mark II, the differences were very minor. You had 120 frames per second in 1080, but only 720 on the 5D Mark IV. And you had I believe, if I remember correctly, it was 4K 60 on the 1DX Mark II, but 4K 30 on the 5D Mark IV. Maybe I'm getting my cameras mixed up a little, but the differences were minor. So once they came out with the R5, those video features should easily have gone into the R1. So unless, of course, as you're saying, they had better video features planned for the R3 and they've toned it down a little bit. I mean, it's possible, but that's what I love about this panel. All the ideas we have of conjecture and all that wonderful stuff. So any final words?
I have just one additional point. I know that Brian had mentioned, I think I saw a comment also from Nick Can about the refresh rate and the EVF basically. Now I've got an R5 and an R6. And with the R5, which I do use to shoot birds, and you mentioned, Brian, about basically shooting with 2 eyes when shooting wrestling. I mean, I do that also in terms of bird spotting, especially when I'm looking for the bird. Although since I'm very strongly right-eyed anyway, once I've locked onto the bird, the left eye really doesn't bother me. The R5 has a refresh rate in the EVF. I think it defaults to 120 hertz, and you can turn it down to less than that. But 120, I mean, it's really smooth and I'm an eyeglass wearer. I'm blind without it, so. It hasn't bothered me. I would think the R3 would be at least as good, if not better, in terms of refresh rate and having less strain on the eyes.
That's good feedback. I appreciate you letting me know about that, because everyone's different, right? So it's good to get that differing opinion. I do want to mention, you mentioned about how Canon has the new eye detect autofocus, which I think
I control autofocus. Yeah,
eye control. Minolta had that on their film cameras. I don't know if you remember, Minolta film cameras had the ability to look and it would focus where you look. So I don't know if that's
the EOS 3 had that too.
Yeah, that was like 20 years ago, and I don't know how well it worked.
Basically they're trying to bring back that technology and sort of update it. So I'm guessing they've been working on it. They must have been working on it for quite some time now, and now I guess they just decided now that they're going mirrorless, they're going to try to bring that back. I am curious to see how that works.
Yes.
Especially in situations like weddings and things, or weddings, even like fast paced, like motorsports. But really, so things like wedding, it's like, how is that actually going to work? And also curious, what is the experience of photographers like you guys? How the experience of using something like that, where your eye is really controlling where that focus goes.
Yeah, I mean, if it works, it'll be great. If it does, on the other hand, between that and also having the eye detect autofocus, which of course the Canon cameras have a great one of those, I wonder if the two systems might fight each other to some degree, depending on what you're shooting, how many subjects there are. If the camera focuses on one thing because it's closer and you shift over to something else, will the camera follow you? I mean, the programming behind getting workable eye autofocus is it kind of so I'm really interested to see how that particular facet of the camera works, because if it does, then that's something that down the road might trickle down to more of your mid-range bodies, like R5 successor or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm definitely going to try that out at a Birds of Prey workshop or shooting wrestling. I think those are two challenging situations. I should put those to the test. And I think it's interesting, Gaston, he says that he thinks camera companies are realizing that big, vast majority of their users are willing to pay higher prices. I agree. We are selling a lot of really expensive cameras. I've got an Alpha 1 going out on Thursday, and people seem to have the money to do it. So they've got amazing technology in cameras these days. They can do amazing things. You can shoot at ridiculous ISOs. Somebody commented, what's the low light like? I obviously can't tell you. But I tell you, with that many pixels, with the computer processing they have, I don't know. I'm a big fan of less pixels for low light. So I'm not really sure how these cameras are going to
Yeah,
compare.
I mean that's
Yeah,
always
it
been a
all
common thought, but I've seen with some studies that indicate that maybe it may not be as, especially with the modern sensors and modern processors, that having smaller, larger pixels may not be as important for low light performance as it would have been maybe a few years ago. So I
I
guess
saw that
the
video.
proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, I saw
yeah.
the video and I got very angry actually watching it. I don't know if it's the same thing you're talking about, John, but I saw a video where they were talking about how pixel size and pixel numbers don't really matter as much for low light. And I'm
Yeah,
watching this thinking, okay, so this guy's basically asking me to forget physics. And that really annoyed me to no end.
No, I,
So
I mean,
yeah.
I
I
walked
think I
away from
read
that.
that rather than a video, but
it's a mix. It's a mix.
I've
Overall,
seen the
yes,
difference.
the pixel size does matter. The photo sites does matter, but given the technology, it really comes down to how good the sensor is, and
Absolutely.
also how good the processors. The processor and the
Absolutely.
The
sensor,
processors made a huge
um,
difference.
right.
And
yeah,
that's
because
progressed leaps and
the
bounds.
processor can make a huge difference. I think the A7 III is a perfect example, where it was a 24 megapixel, but if you compared it to the A7S III, which was a 12 megapixel, even though it had more resolutions, typically means not as good in low light. It still was not as good as the A7S II, but it was close enough that people were able to offset because you were getting the higher resolution.
Well, there are lots of videos on this, and I can say from my experience when I bought the R5, I was very disappointed right away because I couldn't produce great videos with this camera. And the simple reason is I'd gone from a hobbyist camera like the 70D up to a professional camera where you have to understand the triangle. You have to understand how ISO works. You have to understand how exposure works. You have to understand how aperture works, and you can't just work with a camera. You need things like monitors. You need lighting in certain situations. You really have to know an awful lot. And only now, if you watch my latest few videos when I've been out in the forest in really, really low light situations, are you seeing that I'm actually producing really good video, quality video that is what the camera is capable of. So a lot of times when we see some of these videos where they're comparing it, keep in mind too, it depends on whose hands the camera is in. Their skill and artistry is how they can produce really incredible effects. Even going back to cameras like Pentax. Pentax was a great innovator. They were the first to come out with the SLR, first with autofocus. And it takes the right technology at the right time and the right people to produce great results. So I know we could stay on the R3 for an awful lot of time here, but I know, look, we've got, I don't know why I've got so many people watching right now, 66 people watching, and I know some of you are waiting for the A7 IV. So I'm going to
Make sure
change.
to hit that like for everybody in the stream.
Thank you, James.
Yeah,
Help with the
everybody like.
algorithm.
Like
Hey,
and subscribe.
Gaston, I see you in the
Yes.
chat, man. Thanks for joining.
And thanks for that
Gaston's a
shameless
YouTuber.
plug. If you like this video, well, stay tuned. I've got more of them coming. But keep in mind, this is a pre-recorded segment from my weekly Camera News live show, which is every Friday between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And if you like covering the news and if you would like to collaborate, well, then join me live Friday nights where you can ask questions and interact with the panelists. And panelists cover a range of the camera industry. We have photo experts and video experts. We have camera news or industry insiders. And once in a while, I have some guests from other channels such as Jordan Drake or Dan Watson. But again, thank you so much for watching The Ordinary Filmmaker. Please don't forget to punch that like and subscribe button, as it really does help my channel grow. We'll see you again soon.